Welcome to the fourth episode of the Native American Wars podcast. Today's Columbus Day. You guys aren't going to get this podcast on Columbus Day, but we are doing our first episode dealing with Columbus today.
Wait a minute, Greg. Wait. Isn't it Indigenous Peoples Day also?
Yes, it is, Mike. Thank you. I just came across that great tweet, fuck Christopher Columbus. And
yeah, well, once again, illustrating there's two sides to this story, right? There's the Columbus side and the Indigenous people side.
We'll try to look at him from both points of view.
Let's do that.
All right.
Well, so today we're gonna start with our famous explorer, Europeans' famous explorer Columbus. With his, sailed the ocean blue in 1492. It rhymes. I think that's a poem that someone wrote at some point that I can't remember exactly who it was. But he was Spanish-funded, Italian-born, and he accidentally bumped into some islands in the Caribbean that we don't know which exactly those were, but he began, at that time, the post-Columbian era of the indigenous peoples. So,
Post-Columbian, meaning after Columbus?
Right. Now, I understand that this is a podcast about North American wars, right? The North American conflicts between Europeans and the indigenous peoples. But you just can't ignore Columbus. He never set foot anywhere
we should
in the North
designate
American continent.
Post-Columbian by PC, which we definitely are not.
Well, apparently not. I'm trying as hard as I can to be PC. But apparently it's not working. However, we need to talk about the Spanish because they actually did show up. Columbus is the first, well, he's Italian, but he was funded by the Spanish, and his peeps that have sailed the ocean blue with him were Spanish, right?
Yeah, and the Spanish were the first Europeans to explore Florida and the American South, Mississippi River Basin, Texas, New Mexico, and California, right?
Right, exactly. So, we'll start with the Spanish. And we have to start with the Spanish and talk about their contacts with peoples living in the Caribbean about 1492. I mean, that's the big one. That's the big bang, right? And their inevitable falling out. Now, for a second, I want to talk about sources. I know it's boring, but the majority of the stuff related to Columbus and the Spanish and everything comes from their journals, comes from what I would consider to be quasi-reliable sources. So we, in our infinite wisdom, have decided to pick the stuff that we like and move on with that. Not so much concerned about any other, details. So don't get caught up in the details of what we're trying to say here. If you've got a correction, you can always contact us and tell us we're wrong, because we like that. So here we have a
You
guy.
like that. I don't like that.
We have a guy named Christopher Columbus. Okay, he's an Italian. He was from Genoa. And he was the son of a middle-class weaver, and he claimed to have gone to sea when he was a boy of 10 years old. We don't know if that's true or not, but that's what he claimed. It's probably believable. He was actually a pretty good sailor. Okay, he apprenticed with some merchants in Genoa. He was able to marry the daughter of a prominent Portuguese nobleman. He had a kid. In other words, this is not a normal guy. This guy was already at the top of his game. As a merchant and sailor, and he had contacts in Portugal. His wife was from Portugal. She was the daughter of a Portuguese nobleman. He had a son, and pretty soon after that, his wife died. When he was a young man, he did a lot of sailing. He sailed all over the world. He went to Iceland, Ireland, Africa. At some point during these travels, his wife died. For our purposes, it doesn't really matter when. But he moved to Castile in 1485. Castile is a part of Spain, and it's the kingdom of his future patron, Isabella of Spain. Isabella I. Everyone knows Ferdinand and Isabella, correct?
Right, not personally, but I've heard of them.
Right, they're important people. In fact, during the time frame, now remember, this is 1492. This is the Middle Ages, right? The medieval period. They were fantastic.
Pre-Renaissance.
Well, no, they were around the same time. But anyway, the point is, they were, well, of course, was there really a Renaissance in Spain, right? It's ultra-Catholic. So anyway, let's move forward from there and say,
Well, the Inquisition was a type of Renaissance, wasn't it?
Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition.
all right, let's move. That's foreshadowing, by the way, for you literary types. Okay, but let's talk about Chris for a couple more seconds. He was ambitious. He was smart. He taught himself how to speak and read 4 to 5 languages. He was incredibly widely read for the son of a bourgeois craftsman. Okay, he was also a Christian apocalyptic and felt that God had his finger on his little wind stem and moved. You know, I'm talking about the winder for a clock, and so it moved him. God was actually moving him, is what he thought, right? Any comments about that one? It seems like it's
pretty incredibly arrogant as well, from what I hear.
I believe that God is moving my wine stem. Greg. So let's look at the world that Chris lived in, okay? Old Chris. The circumstances that drove him west, right? So let's talk for a second about what makes the Spanish monarchy want to fund somebody to travel across an unexplored set of ocean in the middle of nowhere with
Mike,
no hope of finding.
Can I ask you a question here?
Yeah.
So was he doing the whole hop down the coast of Africa thing for the Portuguese as well?
No. That's where this all comes in, because basically what we're talking about is a route to Asia. That's what Columbus wanted. That's what really the Portuguese wanted it. Every seafaring people in Europe wanted a quick way to Asia. Now, why did they suddenly need to have a way to Asia?
Spices
and such. But why did they need it all of a sudden? And the reason why they needed it was because sometime in the early 1400s, a city named Constantinople, right? Remember They Might Be Giants, that song? Became Istanbul. That's because the Ottoman Turks captured and pretty much destroyed the Byzantine Empire, which was
This
Greek.
was post-Byzantine.
Right. So now we're talking about the Turks, Muslims, controlling access to the trade routes to Asia. So now, for years, since really the Crusade era, people had been taking camels and mules and such to China and Marco Polo, right? And then bringing all the stuff, noodles, right? Spaghetti noodles, fireworks. I mean, what other cliched thing can we find, right? Szechuan sauce. Bringing it back from China, right, to Europe. Well, suddenly, here we go. The Ottomans say, you're Christians, sorry. Unless you convert to, Islam, we're going to kill you and destroy you, right? So,
And Columbus would have been familiar with Islam.
yes, he would. He would be familiar. Everyone in Spain would be, because Spain had been conquered in the 700s.
But the Muslims were on their last legs in Spain at this time.
They were on their last gasp. It's true. So the point, my point is, now suddenly the Europeans, in particular the Spanish and Portuguese, who at the time were the premier explorers and sailors of the time, needed a way to get to Asia. Now there's 2 ways, right? Which we'll discuss in a few minutes. Everyone knew that the world was not flat. It was round. So
not everyone.
You could go around the world to go to Asia.
Anyone with an education.
So you could set off straight west, cross this giant unknown ocean tract, and go. Eventually you'll hit Asia, right? Or you could go down around what was known, Africa was known, all the way down to the coast. You could go all the way down the coast of Africa, sail south, and then east, and find Asia.
Is that Cape Horn or the Cape of Good Hope?
Around Cape.
That's Cape of
I
Good
think
Hope.
that's Cape Horn, isn't it?
It's Cape of Good Hope.
It's the Cape of Good Hope. You're right, because it's South Africa down there now. Anyway, the point is, Chris Columbus initially was in Portugal, and he was trying to sell the King of Portugal on going across the ocean blue, west. And the King of Portugal was sort of saying, hey, yeah, that's a great idea, except, so he said, I have a guy going east, and we'll see. And, he kept Columbus on pins and needles until this guy came back and said, oh, yeah, it's easy. You just sail down around South Africa, and boom, you're there. You're in Asia. So the Portuguese king was no longer interested in funding this expedition to go out west. So Columbus I mean, okay, it's a lot more complicated than this, but let's just simplify it and say he said, hey, I'm going to go to Spain. So he goes to Spain, and he tries to get Ferdinand and Isabella to fund his trip west. Now, Ferdinand and Isabella were involved in a number of items at this point. They were a little busy. Spain,
The Siege of Granada being one.
well, Spain was involved. Spain in the 700s had been conquered by the Muslims, and since that time, the Umayyad Caliphate. Right, this is a group of Berbers and Muslims who had come up through across the Straits of Gibraltar and invaded Spain all the way up to. Have you ever heard of what's his name? Charlemagne.
Right. Well, Charles Martel turned them back at Poitiers.
Charles Martel
732.
and Charlemagne turned them back in what's now southern Gaul or France. So anyway, for a long time, the Caliphate ruled Spain. As Christians grew in power in Spain, they pushed the Muslims further and further south. And by the time of Ferdinand and Isabella, they had the Muslims cornered in a small province in the southernmost part of Spain.
At one time, I just read that 80% of the people in Spain were Muslim.
It's very possible. Muslims and Jews. Now, the Muslims had a very what we would call, compared to what was to come, they had a very enlightened set of rules. In other words, if you were a Jewish person that lived in the Muslim part of Spain, you could pay a tax and stay a Jew. If you were a Christian and lived in a certain part of the Muslim Caliphate, you could pay a tax and remain a Christian.
It was just good business.
It was good business, and it stopped all the fighting and such.
The Inquisition?
Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition.
So anyway, when Ferdinand and Isabella were in power, they were ultra-Catholics. And they were blessed by the Pope and encouraged by the Pope to drive the Muslims out of Spain, which after unifying their kingdom, they zealously drove the Muslims out of Spain. And the Pope, last Muslim
with
stronghold,
extreme prejudice.
what was the last stronghold in Spain?
Granada.
Granada, which is where I invaded, right?
Yeah.
But anyway, different part. But
Yours was Grenada.
Grenada, that's right. All right. Well, anyway, they get pushed out of Granada. The Muslims are gone, right? Guess what year that happened?
1492?
Boom. There you go. 1492. So after years and years, after 700 years of Muslim occupation, they were now, once again, united Catholic kingdom. The problem, of course, is, as you noted, all sorts of people from all sorts of races were allowed to live in Spain under the Muslims. When Ferdinand and Isabella took over, the only people that were allowed to live in Spain were
Catholics?
Catholics. Right. Exactly. The Pope decreed them as Catholic kings. So Spain, by decree from Ferdinand and Isabella, was only for Catholics. No non-Catholics allowed. So they grabbed all the Muslims and Jews they could find and said, okay, you either convert to Catholicism or get the hell out of the country. So they converted for the most part because they had families and businesses, et cetera, et cetera. Well, soon it was established that wasn't good enough. The original group of Spanish Catholics, the old-time families, were jealous, mostly because the Jewish and Muslim folks had, good businesses.
Can we talk about some Native Americans?
Yeah, in a minute or two. But anyway, the point is they wanted to, the old established families wanted to root out the false Christians. So the Pope gave them the right to, in 1478, something called a papal bull establishing the Spanish
Oh, the Inquisition?
This
Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition.
Don't give me your papal bull.
people that had converted from Muslims or Jewish to Catholicism were the ones that the Spanish Inquisition was aimed at, because they didn't want any false conversions, but also, they wanted their money and estates. So anyway, we're talking about a people, the Spanish people, these are brutal people who treated their own people that they were neighbors. Their neighbors. They treated them as though they were.
And they had an extreme agenda, didn't they?
Exactly. They were, like I say, they were not a nice people.
But they knew how to sail.
Right. They did know how to sail. So anyway, to set the stage for all this, you have to understand the people who were getting ready to bump into by accident are indigenous cousins here that were already in the country here. So next episode, when we fly off the handle, it'll be about the people that they ran into, the people that populated the Caribbean.
So next
Cuba.
episode, we're going to actually meet some Native Americans.
Yes.
Okay.
But first we have to meet the people that are getting
Oh,
ready to bump
I
into.
understand. I understand that.
Because you have to understand the context of where they. Okay, do you want to be? Can you imagine being conquered by the Muslims and having to live under their liberal rule, right?
No, I cannot.
Yeah, because they're liberals, and we know, right? Got to stay away from that
All right.
if you're American.
Well, we're going to wrap this episode up. And, hey, I'd like to put in a small plug for Elijah P's Burgers and Brews in downtown Alton, Illinois, who's helping us with, well, at this point, maybe a dinner now and then. So, signing off till next week, okay?